The sale barn at Dunbar's Livestock was packed tighter than usual that Saturday morning, the kind of crowd that showed up less for the auction itself and more for the spectacle of watching somebody else's bad decisions get made in public. Dellie Foss stood near the rail with her hands in her jacket pockets, watching lot after lot of cattle and goats move through the ring, waiting for the one she'd actually driven out for. When the gate finally opened and 90 ewes shuffled into the pen, thin enough that their spines showed clean lines beneath dull, matted wool, a low murmur went through the stands that wasn't quite a laugh yet, but was heading there fast. The auctioneer barely slowed down for them. Bulk lot, 90 head, previous owner liquidating stock, sold as is with no health guarantee. Somebody 2 rows behind. Dellie muttered loud enough for half the barn to hear that whoever bought that lot was buying somebody else's. Mistake at a discount, and a ripple of laughter followed the comment down the bleachers. Dellie raised her hand at the number she'd already decided on before she ever walked in, and the auctioneer's gavel came down almost before anyone realized somebody had actually bid. The laughter that followed wasn't subtle. A man in a canvas coat 2 seats down leaned toward his neighbor and said, not quietly at all, that somebody just paid actual money for 90 sheep that looked like they'd walked out of a famine. Another voice from further back agreed loud enough to carry, calling it the worst buy of the morning, maybe the worst buy of the year. Dellie signed the paperwork at the clerk's window without acknowledging any of it, aware of eyes on her back the whole walk across the lot, aware that by Monday morning half the county would have heard some version of what she'd just done. She stood at the clerk's window a few minutes longer than the paperwork strictly required, partly to finish the transaction properly and partly because walking straight back out into that crowd immediately felt like giving them exactly the reaction they were hoping for. Through the window she could still hear fragments of conversation drifting down from the stands behind her, somebody wondering out loud whether she even knew what she was looking at when she raised her hand, somebody else speculating that she must have money to burn if she was willing to gamble it on a lot that looked like it belonged at a rendering plant rather than a working farm. None of it was said quietly enough to pretend it wasn't meant for her. An older woman near the concession stand, someone Dellie didn't recognize, caught her eye on the way out and gave her a small, sympathetic look that was almost worse than the open mockery, the kind of look that said she felt bad for a stranger about to lose money on a bad decision. Dellie nodded back politely and kept walking, because there wasn't much use explaining herself to a barn full of people who'd already reached their verdict before she'd even signed the bill of sale. She drove the flock home in 2 trips with a borrowed stock trailer, 90 ewes crowded together in the back, most of them too weak or too listless to do much more than stand and sway with the motion of the truck. She unloaded them into the empty pasture behind her barn, the same pasture that had sat unused since she'd let her last flock go 2 years earlier, and stood at the gate afterward just watching them. 90 animals that looked less like livestock and more like the shadow of what livestock was supposed to look like. She'd read enough about condition scoring by then to know roughly what she was looking at without needing a vet to confirm it. She waded into the flock that first evening and ran her hand along a handful of backs the way the books described, feeling for fat cover over the spine and ribs, and found mostly bone under thin, dull wool scores she'd have put somewhere around a 1.5 out of 5 if she'd had to commit to a number. A properly conditioned A-way should feel rounded through the loin, muscle, and a little padding over the spine. These felt like something closer to a washboard. Word got to Dunbar's feed and supply before she even made it there herself the following Monday. She walked in for a bag of mineral supplement and found 3 men already gathered near the counter, mid-conversation, and she caught enough of it before they noticed her to know exactly what they were discussing. One of them, an older rancher named Pete Ashford, was saying something about how a body could tell in about 2 seconds whether a flock was worth saving or whether it was better off going straight to a processor for whatever scrap value was left in it, and from the tone of his voice it was clear which category he'd already sorted her 90 ewes into. He spotted her rounding the aisle and didn't have the decency to look embarrassed about it. just gave her a small nod and kept right on talking, loud enough now that there was no pretending it wasn't meant for her to hear. She bought her mineral supplement, made sure to ask specifically for the sheep formulation, rather than the general livestock, blend sitting one shelf over, remembering clearly from her reading that cattle mineral could run copper levels high enough to poison a flock of sheep outright. The clerk mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd sold more sheep mineral in the last week than the previous 6 months combined, on account of everybody in town wanting to see how her experiment played out. She didn't dignify that with much of a response either, just paid for what she needed and left, aware of the same eyes on her back she'd felt at the auction. The diner crowd had their own version of the story by midweek, one that had grown considerably in the retelling, the way stories in Cutter's Fork always did. Carol, working the counter that Wednesday morning, told a table of regulars that she'd heard Dellie Foss had paid full price for a flock of dying sheep just to prove some kind of point, and one of the men at the table laughed hard enough to draw attention from the rest of the room, saying that pride was an expensive thing to be buying at auction prices. Dellie happened to walk in halfway through that exact conversation, coffee order already in mind, and the table went quiet in that same awkward, half-second way rooms tended to go quiet around her these days. She ordered her coffee, sat at the counter instead of joining anyone, and let the room's silence stretch out until normal conversation resumed around her, without including her in it. She kept a notebook, same as she always did, and the first entry set the tone for everything that followed. 90 U's, bulk lot, average condition score, maybe 1.5. Previous owner liquidating, no health history provided. Half the county thinks I paid for somebody else's failure. Plan. Separate weakest third into their own paddock. Introduce grain slowly, sheep-specific mineral only. Reassess in 3 weeks. She spent the first several days doing nothing more dramatic than sorting. She walked the flock daily, running her hands along backs and ribs, marking the weakest third with a dab of livestock paint on their flanks and moving them into a smaller paddock closer to the barn where she could feed them separately from the stronger 2/3. It was slower work than it sounded. 90 animals that didn't much want to be caught or handled by a stranger, skittish in the particular way undernourished animals often are, quick to spook and slow to trust. She spent one entire afternoon just getting close enough to a dozen of them to run a proper hand along their spines, patient in a way she'd had to relearn after 2 years without a flock of her own to practice on. She'd read enough to know that dominant animals would crowd out weaker ones at a shared feed trough every time, the strong getting stronger while the weak stayed exactly where they started, and she wasn't willing to let 90 animals sort themselves into winners and losers when the whole point was bringing all of them back at once. She built a second, smaller feed trough specifically for the marked group, positioned far enough from the main paddock that the stronger animals couldn't push their way in, and started a feeding log that first week, tracking exactly how much each group consumed, adjusting portions daily based on what was actually being eaten rather than what she'd originally estimated. Some of the weakest ewes barely touched their feed those first few days, appetite suppressed by whatever combination of stress and poor condition had brought them to auction in the first place, and she found herself sitting in the paddock some evenings just watching them eat, willing them silently to take one more mouthful before she gave up and went inside for the night. She introduced grain the way the books insisted it had to be done, in small increments over more than a week, watching carefully for any sign of digestive trouble, because she also knew that sudden grain access could send a thin, hungry animal into acidosis fast enough to kill it before she noticed anything was wrong. She started them on quarter-pound increments, watching manure consistency and appetite daily, adding a little more every few days as their systems adjusted, resisting the urge to rush the process, even though every part of her wanted to see faster progress than the schedule allowed. The first genuine scare came 10 days in, when one of the weaker ewes went down in the smaller paddock one morning and wouldn't get back up on her own. Dellie found her lying on her side, breathing shallow, belly slightly distended in a way that made her stomach drop with the memory of every warning she'd read about grain introduced too fast. She called the vet immediately, hands not quite steady on the phone, convinced in that first panicked hour that she'd made the exact mistake the books had spent so many pages warning her against. The vet arrived within the hour, a woman named Sandra who Dellie had used once before for a mule with a bad hoof, and worked the down A-way over carefully, checking her gums, her gut sounds, the rate of her breathing, moving with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who'd seen plenty of farmers panic over things that turned out fine and plenty more stay calm over things that didn't. Dellie stood off to one side, arms crossed tight, running through every step of the grain introduction in her head, trying to figure out where exactly she'd rushed it. What quarter-pound increment had been the one that pushed things too far? Sandra straightened up after a few minutes and delivered a verdict that came as a genuine relief once Dellie's heart rate settled enough to actually hear it. It wasn't acidosis. It was simple exhaustion, a body that then finally running out of whatever reserve had been keeping it upright, made worse by a mild parasite load the vet found on a quick fecal check, common enough in a flock that had clearly gone unmanaged for a while before it ever reached the auction. Sandra dewormed the whole flock that same afternoon as a precaution, working through all 90 animals methodically while she explained, mostly for Dellie's benefit, that internal parasites alone could keep an animal thin no matter how good the feed was, that a flock could be eating perfectly balanced rations and still lose the battle if something in the gut was stealing the nutrition before the body ever got to use it. She told Dellie plainly, packing her kit back into the truck afterward, that her instincts on the feeding schedule had actually been sound, that the gradual grain introduction was exactly right, and that the mistake, if there'd been one at all, was buying a flock without knowing its full health history rather than anything Dellie had done since bringing them home. Dellie asked, a little hesitantly, whether the down A-way would recover. Sandra said the odds were good, now that the parasite load was addressed, and that the next few days would tell the story, better than anything she could promise. Standing in a pasture at 4 in the afternoon, she wrote it all down that night with her hands finally steady again. Down A-way, A10. Not acidosis, exhaustion, and parasites. Wormed the whole flock today. Vet says my feeding plan is right. Just needed patience and a health check I should have pushed for at the sale. Won't skip that step again. Roy heard about the down A-way before Dellie had even finished writing about it. The way everything traveled through Cutter's Fork faster than seemed physically possible. He stopped by 2 days later, ostensibly to drop off a part for her truck she hadn't ordered, the same excuse he always used, and stood at the paddock fence, looking over the flock with an expression that wasn't quite as smug as it had been the week before. He asked how bad it had gotten with the sick one. She told him the truth, that it had scared her badly for about an hour, but that the vet had confirmed it wasn't anything she'd caused, and that the whole flock had been wormed since, and was already looking marginally steadier for it. He didn't have much to say to that, just looked at the ewes a while longer, noted out loud that they still looked pretty rough to his eye, and left without committing to any real opinion either way. A hard rain moved through the county in the middle of the 4th week, 3 days of steady cold downpour that turned the smaller paddock into a shallow bowl of standing water, before she managed to trench a drainage channel along the low side of the fence line. She spent most of one afternoon out there in a slicker, shovel in hand, cutting a path for the water to run off before it soaked through the shelter bedding and left 90 already fragile animals standing in cold, wet mud overnight. She moved the weakest of them temporarily into a dry corner of the barn itself. More animals crowded into less space than she'd have liked, but preferable by far to leaving them exposed to a soaking that could undo weeks of careful feeding in a single bad night. She stayed out later than she meant to that evening, checking each A-way by hand for signs of chill, wet wool clinging cold against thin bodies that didn't yet have the fat reserves to fight off hypothermia the way a healthier animal could. She lost exactly none of them to that storm, though it wasn't for lack of worry, and she wrote the whole incident down in detail afterward, less as a record of success and more as a reminder of how much a single bad stretch of weather could threaten months of slow, careful work. Storm week 4. Trenched a low paddock, moved weakest group into the barn overnight. No losses, but closer than I'd like. Building a permanent drainage channel before next season. not waiting on another storm to force my hand. The weeks that followed settled into the same kind of quiet, repetitive rhythm she'd come to recognize from every project she'd ever taken on that other people doubted. Feed in the morning, feed in the evening, moisture and mineral checks, condition scoring by hand every few days to track whether the numbers were actually moving or whether she was imagining progress out of sheer stubbornness. By the end of the third week, the timeline the books had promised held up almost exactly. The weakest third in the smaller paddock had started to show the first real signs of change, ribs less prominent under her palm, a little more give over the loin where there'd been nothing but bone before. She widened her rounds to include the larger group by the fourth week, applying the same careful feeding schedule now that the smaller group had proven the approach was working, and by the sixth week the whole flock had moved noticeably up the condition scale, most of them sitting somewhere around a 2 now instead of the 1.5 they'd started at. It wasn't dramatic yet, nothing a passing driver would notice from the road, but it was real, measurable progress that she tracked meticulously in the notebook, numbers she could point to instead of just a feeling. The town's opinion, predictably, moved slower than the sheep did. Pete Ashford stopped by the feed store one afternoon while Dellie happened to be there picking up more mineral supplement, and made a point of asking, in front of the same small crowd that always seemed to gather near the counter, whether her sheep had died yet or whether she was just delaying the inevitable. A couple of the men standing nearby laughed at that, not unkindly exactly, but not gently either, the kind of laughter that assumed the joke was still funny because the outcome hadn't changed. Dellie told him plainly that the flock was up a full condition point since she bought them, that she had the numbers written down if he wanted to see them, and that she'd be happy to let him take a look himself out at the pasture instead of guessing from second-hand gossip. He didn't take her up on the offer, but the room went a little quieter after that, the laughter not quite as easy as it had been a minute before. By the third month, the difference had become the kind of thing even a passing driver might notice, a flock that had gone from skeletal to merely thin, wool starting to fill out with better nutrition behind it, movement across the pasture steadier and more purposeful than the listless shuffling she'd unloaded off the trailer back in the spring. She widened the grain ration slightly again, following the same gradual introduction principle she'd used from the start, and kept the sheep-specific mineral program steady through the whole stretch, careful never to let herself get complacent, just because things were finally moving in the right direction. She noticed the shift in town before anyone said anything about it directly. A delivery driver who passed her pasture twice a week on his regular route mentioned, almost offhand, that her sheep were looking a good deal better than the last time he'd driven by, and asked, genuinely curious rather than mocking, what she'd changed. She told him plainly, same as she told anyone who asked instead of assumed, and he seemed satisfied enough with the answer to bring it up at his next stop, which happened to be Dunbar's feed and supply, which meant the observation was making its way back through the same gossip channel that had carried the original mockery, except this time carrying something closer to grudging curiosity instead of ridicule. She felt the change herself the next time she stopped in for supplies. The usual cluster of men near the counter was there as always, but the conversation had shifted registers slightly, less outright laughter and more a kind of wary reassessment, somebody asking whether it was true her flock was up 2 full condition points already, somebody else saying they'd heard the same thing but hadn't believed it until they'd driven past themselves and seen it firsthand. Pete Ashford was there that day too, quieter than usual, listening more than talking, and Dellie caught him, watching her from across the store, in a way that wasn't quite friendly yet, but wasn't the open smugness of those first weeks either. Nobody apologized to her that day. Nobody needed to. The shift in tone said enough on its own. Shearing time came at the end of that first full season, and she brought in a shearer 2 counties over, who'd handled flocks of every size and condition, curious herself what kind of fleece 90 recovering ewes would actually produce after a season of careful feeding. He arrived early on a cool morning with his trailer and his own set of clippers, and worked through the first dozen animals quickly, efficiently, without much comment, the way a man works when he's done a job 10,000 times before, and doesn't need to narrate it. Around the 20th away, though, He paused long enough to run a fleece through his hands more slowly than the others, checking the crimp and the length against the light from the barn door, and mentioned, almost to himself, that this was better wool than he usually saw off a flock that had clearly gone through a hard patch not too long before. Dellie didn't say much back, just took the compliment for what it was and kept nagging fleeces into the burlap sacks lined up along the barn wall. The shearer worked through the flock over 2 long days, and Dellie stood by collecting fleeces into burlap sacks, checking each one roughly by feel the way she'd read wool buyers did: staple length, crimp, how clean it felt compared to the matted, dull wool she remembered from that first evening in the pasture. By the end of the second day, she had a stack of sacks taller than she was, more raw wool than she'd handled in any single season with her previous flock, and she stood in the barn doorway that evening just looking at it, tired in the satisfied way that came from 2 full days of physical work rather than worry. She drove the wool to a regional buyer the following week, half expecting a discouraging number given how rough the flock had looked only months earlier, and sat in the small office off the receiving dock while a woman in a canvas apron worked through sample after sample, calling out micron counts and yield percentages to a younger assistant taking notes on a clipboard. Dellie tried not to hover, though she caught herself leaning slightly toward the scale each time a new sack went up, doing rough math in her head before the official numbers came back. The grading came back solid across the board, a decent micron count and yield that put the price per pound well above what she'd braced herself for, especially with wool prices running unusually strong that year compared to recent seasons, the buyer mentioning almost as an aside that prices were up substantially from where they'd sat the year before, a stretch of good fortune in the market that had nothing to do with anything Dellie had done, but that landed at exactly the right time regardless. She did the math sitting in her truck in the buyer's parking lot before she even drove home, multiplying pounds against price per pound scrawled on the back of the receipt the buyer had handed her, and the total came out to a number that made the auction price she'd paid for the flock, the same price half the county had mocked her for spending, look less like a bad investment and considerably more like the opposite. She sat there a good while longer than the math required, just letting the numbers settle in, before she finally started the truck and drove home. She didn't rush to tell anyone. She never had. But numbers like that didn't stay quiet in a town the size of Cutter's Fork, and within 2 weeks the wool check had become its own piece of gossip working its way through the same channels the original mockery had traveled through, except this time the tone had shifted into something closer to reluctant respect, mixed with a healthy dose of embarrassment from anyone who'd laughed loudest back at the sale barn. Pete Ashford came out to her place himself that fall. No excuse about truck parts this time. Just drove up and asked if he could see the flock in person. He stood at the pasture fence for a long while, looking at 90 sheep that bore almost no resemblance to the animals he'd written off at auction months earlier, wool full and healthy, bodies filled out with real muscle and condition instead of visible bone. He was quiet longer than she expected, hands resting on the top rail, watching the flock move across the pasture with the same steady, purposeful grazing she'd once thought she might never see out of them. He asked her, more genuinely curious than she expected from him, how she'd turned it around so completely from a lot everyone in the barn that day had assumed was headed for the processor within weeks. She could tell the question cost him something to ask, a man who'd built a fair amount of his, standing in that county unknowing, livestock at a glance, admitting now that his glance had been wrong about 90 animals, by a wide enough margin that it was worth driving out to confirm in person. She told him the same thing she always told people who finally asked instead of assumed. Separate the weak from the strong so the weak actually get fed. Bring grain in slow. Use the right mineral. Give it real time instead of expecting a miracle inside a month. Nothing about it had been complicated. It had just required doing the unglamorous parts correctly and sticking with it longer than most people were willing to. He admitted, standing there at the fence, that he'd been the loudest voice mocking her purchase back at the sale barn, and that he supposed he owed her some kind of acknowledgement for how wrong that assessment had turned out to be. She told him it was fine, that she'd heard worse from better friends over the years, and that the sheep didn't much care what anybody in that barn had said about them so long as they'd gotten fed properly since. He laughed at that for real this time and admitted he had a small flock of his own back home that had been drifting thinner the last couple of seasons without him paying it much attention, and asked a little sheepishly whether she'd be willing to take a look sometime. She said she would, and drove out to his place the following week with her notebook in hand, walking his flock the same way she'd learned to walk her own, hands on backs and ribs, sorting mentally into who needed separate feeding and who was carrying enough condition to be left alone. His flock wasn't in nearly as rough a shape as hers had been, thin in patches rather than uniformly emaciated, but the same basic principles applied, and she walked him through, setting up a separate feeding area for his weakest third the same way she had, marked with the same kind of livestock paint she still had left over from her own flock sorting. It wasn't a large operation, nothing like the kind of consulting work she'd ever imagined doing, but word of it got around the same way everything did in that county, and by the following spring she'd looked over 3 other flocks belonging to men who'd have sooner eaten their own hats than admitted a year earlier that they were taking sheep advice from the woman who'd bought 90 dying ewes at auction for a laugh line. One of them, a younger farmer named Cole, who'd only taken over his family's operation a couple of years back, called her almost weekly that first season with questions, nervous the way she remembered being nervous herself with her very first ducks, and she found herself walking him through the same gradual grain introduction, the same mineral considerations, the same patience with a timeline that felt unbearably slow until it suddenly wasn't. She didn't charge any of them for the advice, the same way she hadn't charged anyone for help with the vorms the year before, figuring the goodwill mattered more in a county this size than a few dollars an hour ever would. What she did start doing, quietly, was keeping a small side business selling her own surplus lambs the following spring to buyers who'd specifically sought her out because they wanted stock from a flock they'd watched recover from nothing, a kind of reputation she hadn't set out to build but found herself grateful for regardless. The diner conversation that stuck with her longest came the following winter, nearly a year after that first Saturday at the sale barn, when Carol stopped her on the way out one morning and asked, without much preamble, whether it was true she'd turned down buying another discount lot at the last auction because she genuinely thought the flock in question was too far gone to save. Dellie confirmed it, told her honestly that not every thin flock was a nutrition problem waiting to be solved, that sometimes an animal really was too sick or too old to bring back, and that she'd learned to tell the difference the hard way over the past year. Carol admitted, a little sheepishly, that she'd been one of the loudest voices at that first diner conversation, calling the whole thing a waste of money, and said she supposed an apology was overdue, even this far out from the original joke. Dellie told her there was nothing to apologize for, that watching a good story get worse in the telling was half the entertainment value of living somewhere this small, and Carol laughed, genuinely, in a way that felt like the last loose thread of that whole episode finally tying itself off. She wrote the closing entry in that first notebook. On a cold evening the following spring, the pasture outside settled and quiet, 90 ewes grazing, steadily in condition scores she'd have been proud to show off at any county fair. 90 ewes bought as a joke, wool sold at a price that more than covered the purchase inside one season. Wormed once, fed correctly, given the time everybody in that sale barn assumed they didn't have. Started this because a flock nobody wanted looked, to me, like a flock nobody had bothered to actually feed. She closed the notebook and set it beside the others on the shelf. The ducks and mules and quail and vorms, every one of them started the same way, with something the whole town had already decided wasn't worth the trouble, and a decision on her part to check for herself before agreeing with them. She walked out to the pasture that evening, before heading in for the night, the same as she did most evenings now out of habit more than necessity, watching 90 sheep graze steadily in the last of the daylight, wool thick enough now to catch the low gold light and away it never had that first Saturday, when they'd come off the trailer looking like the worst decision anyone in that barn had ever watched somebody make out loud. She thought sometimes, standing out there at the fence line, about how much of the whole year had come down to things that weren't complicated, at all once you actually did them. Separate the weak from the strong. Bring feed in slow enough that a body could actually use it instead of choking on it. Get the right mineral instead of whatever was cheapest or closest on the shelf. Wait longer than felt comfortable before deciding something wasn't working. None of it had required any particular talent, just a willingness to do the unglamorous, repetitive parts correctly for as many weeks in a row as it took, long after the joke had stopped being funny to anyone still telling it. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been laughed at for an investment nobody else believed in. Drop your city in the comments, and if you've ever proven a whole room wrong just by sticking with something longer than anybody expected you to tell me what it was. I read everyone, and I'd like to know